You are listening to another edition of Block Report Radio with the People's Minister of Information, J.R. Today, our honored guest is the legendary historian and author, Dr. Gerald Horne. He is going to be talking to us today about current events in Africa, from Angola to the Congo to the Sahel, and more. Mr. Horne, first question. Angola has been big in the news lately. After Biden's last trip as the American president to an African country where he proposed linking the mineral mines of the DRC to the shipping ports of Angola via railway to more efficiently exploit the resources of the Congo. Also in Angola, the president of the DRC, Felix Tshisekedi, was supposed to begin peace talks with Rwanda's president, Paul Kagame, who didn't even bother to show up to the talks about ending a genocidal war that has already accumulated 10 million dead over the span of the conflict. What are your thoughts on Angola's pivotal role in international politics currently?
Well, this is nothing new. You may recall that during the bad old days of the African slave trade, Angola was a hunting ground for enslaved Africans, and indeed, a disproportionate percentage of Black Americans actually are Angolan Americans. You may also recall that in Louisiana, as we speak, in the Deep South, there's Angola State Prison. Now, it's controversial to suggest that this state prison was carrying the name of the Southwest African country, and now houses a significant percentage of what might be called Angolan Americans. And fast forward to 1975, when Angola was surging to independence, and the U.S. was involved in a rather diabolical plot to block that independence under the leadership of the now ruling party, the MPLA, the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, in conjunction with apartheid South Africa. Of course, they were defeated not least because of the assistance from Cuban troops under Comandante Fidel Castro. In any case, that brings us to the current moment where U.S. imperialism feels that it is in some sort of contestation with the People's Republic of China. And that was the underlying reason for Mr. Biden's trip to Southwest Africa. However, you may also know that Angola's trade with China is about 8 times the size of U.S. trade. And this building of the so-called Libido Corridor, which, as you noted correctly, is designed to extract the mineral wealth from that part of Africa and transport it across the Atlantic to the United States, is part of this larger scheme of contestation with the People's Republic of China. In any case, the leader of Angola, President Lorenzo, was sufficiently diplomatic and tactful, not to mention the attempt in 1975 by U.S. imperialism to block Angola's independence, although this other episode that I mentioned, that is to say the looting and plundering of the human capital of Angola in order to fuel economic development of the United States, particularly in the 19th century, that was underscored when Mr. Biden visited the museum in Luanda that depicts and details the history of enslavement in that part of Africa.
Apple is being sued again by the Democratic Republic of Congo for buying conflict minerals from Rwanda and Uganda, using third parties to escape the corporate accountability for employing slave labor in the Congo. The last case, which was a couple of months ago, failed. The lawsuit failed, where Apple was being accused, and we know it's true, of using child slave labor. What do you think about this current case, and what do you think about the impact that it should have on the brand Apple worldwide?
Well, obviously, it should cast serious credibility on the brand of Apple worldwide. But as with Angola, the neighbor of Congo, this has a rather sordid and seeming history. That is to say, that Congo, too, was a hunting ground for enslaved Africans. And not only that, but recall as well the recently released documentary film, which I highly recommend, Soundtrack of a Coup d'etat, that talks about the assassination of the first leader of independent Congo, speaking of Patrice Lumumba, circa January 1961, at the behest of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, not least because Mr. Lumumba was seeking to block neo-colonial incursions into his nation, the Congo, which is larger in territory than Western Europe. It's not only Apple that is sharpening its sword in order to plunder the riches of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Keep in mind that Congo is also a source of various minerals that are essential for the smooth functioning or the functioning at all of the economies of the advanced capitalist countries led by the United States of America. I should also say that the United States is not the only country that's involved in this kind of plunder. There's the former colonial ruler that is Belgium. There is Israel. There are Israeli nationals who are quite essential to the exploitation and plundering of the wealth of the DRC. There is, of course, France, which was a former colonial master in the neighboring Congo, speaking of Congo-Brazzaville, as opposed to the Congo we're talking about, Congo-Kinshasa, the larger Congo. Congo-Brazzaville, of course, is just across the Congo River from the larger Congo, and France was the colonial master there for decades. So there are many fingers of accusation to be pointed when it comes to making an indictment of the North Atlantic imperialist countries for their shameless plundering exploitation of this sprawling African nation.
One of the other biggest genocides that is largely being ignored by the media is the war in the Sudan. Can you give us some history behind the conflict, and what role has the United States and the United Arab Emirates been playing in the conflict?
Even though we routinely refer to Ghana in West Africa as the first African nation to surge to independence post-1957, that is to say, Ghana coming to independence in March 1957, actually it is preceded by the Sudan in 1956. And there hangs a tale because for the longest, particularly in the 19th century, once again, Sudan was shamelessly exploited, not only by Great Britain, but there was a kind of condominium that involved not only Great Britain plundering Congo, but also the neighbor to the north, speaking of Egypt. This was quite a handicap when it came to independence, and it also influenced what became a striking element of post-independence Sudanese history, which is this apparent conflict between the supposedly Muslim North and the supposedly non-Muslim South that led to then U.S. President George W. Bush helping to engineer the split of southern Sudan from the larger Sudan. Until that moment, Sudan was the largest country by territory on the continent of Africa. After the split, that was no longer the case, and there is still bad blood, I'm afraid to say, between South Sudan, an independent country, and the larger Sudan. And that is the backdrop for the current conflict, which your question references. That is to say, in many ways, an internal conflict involving the Sudanese military. The Sudanese military battling a wing of the military, the so-called Rapid Support Forces, the equivalent of, say, the Navy SEALs of the U.S. military, a specialized wing of the Sudanese military. They have been battling, and as your question suggests, the United Arab Emirates has been heavily involved in this conflict, helping to support the Rapid Support Forces. Your audience will not be surprised to find out that mineral wealth is in part at the root of this conflict. Your audience also will not be surprised to ascertain that U.S. imperialism, along with its ally in Israel, are playing a malign role in this conflict because Sudan has an outlet to the Red Sea. And as we speak, going further south along the Red Sea, which abuts the eastern coast of Africa, you'll find that across from the eastern coast of Africa is Yemen. And there we find that Ansar Allah, or the Houthis as they're called in this part of the world, have been involved in a conflict with Israel and U.S. imperialism. Indeed, you might have heard about the crash of U.S. pilots into the Red Sea just in the last day or two as they were battling Ansar Allah. Ansar Allah has fundamentally shut down the Israeli port of Eilat because of their bombarding of this Israeli port. It also has compromised the ability of Egypt to collect revenue from ships sailing through the Red Sea to the Suez Canal, which Egypt controls. And as a result of these commercial and geopolitical interests, that has attracted the malignant attention of U.S. imperialism and the United Arab Emirates and, of course, Israel. It's going to be complicated further by the apparent triumph in Damascus, Syria, of religious zealots backed by Turkey and the United States, because with this apparent triumph of these religious zealots, you're going to see an escalating conflict between Turkey and Israel, and perhaps even Turkey and the United States of America, because the United States of America is supporting Syrian Kurds, which Turkey sees as a mortal threat to Turkey itself. And that, in turn, will cause these outside powers to get involved in that part of Africa, not only the Sudan, which is noted abuts the Red Sea, but also further south and to the east in terms of Somalia, where Turkey plays a major role. It's just across the Red Sea, once again, from Yemen. Recall that Ethiopia, a giant on the African continent, had managed to broker an agreement with the breakaway Somali province of Somaliland to establish an outlet to the sea, which outraged the larger Somalia based in Mogadishu, where, as noted, Turkey plays a major role. And it was thought that that would bring Ethiopia and Somalia into conflict until on December 11th, an agreement was brokered by Turkey, believe it or not, in order to soothe tensions between Mogadishu and Addis Ababa. But that particular accord does not necessarily address what we entered into discussion a moment or two ago. That is to say, this bleeding wound that is Sudan, with flames being fanned by outside forces, not least the United Arab Emirates.
Well, that leads to my next question. What are your thoughts on the International Criminal Court issuing warrants for the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister of Israel? What are your thoughts on the International Court of Justice starting to hear the case of South Africa and other nations that are bringing the genocide claim to Israel as a nation?
Well, the International Criminal Court had been routinely and jokingly referred to as the International Caucasian Court, because it seemed to have a tendency to indict and bring to The Hague leaders or delegates, if you like, from various African conflicts and various African nations. Of course, that is true, generally speaking, of so-called international justice in general, whereby not only African leaders are singled out, but also leaders of formerly socialist states in Eastern Europe, the former Yugoslavia, and the leaders of the former constituent republic of Yugoslavia, speaking of Serbia. So when the International Court broke ranks and indicted Mr. Netanyahu and his erstwhile defense minister, Mr. Gallant, this was greeted with both relief and surprise. However, it also brought fury directed at South Africa, which had established a precedent for this ICC indictment by bringing a case in the International Court of Justice, also in The Hague, making a plausible case for genocide, once again instigated by the Israeli leaders, targeting, of course, Gazans and Palestinians. This indictment, or this case, I should say, brought by South Africa, once again, has caused fury and vehemence in Washington. It's compromised the ability of Pretoria and Washington to maintain sound diplomatic relations. Inevitably, it will lead to further interference in the internal affairs of South Africa. That is the backdrop for rather important news coming from the tip of Africa. I'm referring to the fact that the alliance that delivered independence in South Africa in 1994, speaking of the alliance between the ruling African National Congress, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, and the South African Communist Party, the latter, the SACP, has decided that with regard to local elections in 2026, they will be running candidates against the ANC. They're very dissatisfied, not necessarily with the foreign policy of the ruling ANC, but with the domestic policy, particularly the recent elections, which you saw a dip in the totals garnered by the ANC below the 50% mark, down to 42%. The ANC felt that it should enter an alliance with the neo-apartheid party, the Democratic Alliance, which has outraged forces on the left, which led to this very important meeting in South Africa, spearheaded by the SACP, where former President Thabo Mbeki showed up. Dlamini Zuma, the former spouse of number 3 South African President Jacob Zuma, showed up. She was also a contender for the leadership of the ANC before Cyril Ramaphosa, the current leader and current president, won out. And this is indicative of the fact that there will be an increasingly stiff left-wing challenge to the ANC, which will inevitably put pressure on the ANC to change its domestic policy. The problem, if there is a problem, is that U.S. imperialism will try to play on the contradictions and tensions between the ANC and its erstwhile alliance partner, the SACP, in order to destabilize that particular alliance and to make up lost ground that was lost because of the ANC foreign policy, not least dragging Israel into the International Court of Justice, which, as noted, led simultaneously, if not sequentially, to this International Criminal Court indictment of Mr. Netanyahu, Prime Minister, and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant.
When you look at what's going on in the Sahel region with Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, kicking French troops out of their nations, nationalizing precious metals and mineral mines, building refineries, and going after the heads of multinationals. And when you look at them doing specific things, such as Air France suspended flights to Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger recently, then once Air France started feeling the economic pressure, they wanted to return. The Sahel Alliance reneged on that. Ghana also has broken away from ECOWAS, and it has said that it is possibly going to join the Sahelian Alliance, also along with Chad. What are your thoughts about what's going on in the Sahel region?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of ferment and flux in that part of Africa, spearheaded by Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. It's not only the ferment and flux in those 3 particular nations, it's their influence, which has spread westward into Senegal, which has fed anti-French neocolonial plots in Dakar, which has also spread east into N'Djamena, into Chad, where the military rulers also have booted out the French forces, just as they have been booted out of the Sahel nations aforementioned. But keep in mind that France is not reclining recumbent as these nations are moving against its neocolonial interests. You might have noticed the visit to Paris by President Tinubu of Nigeria, who was feted and garlanded by President Macron in Paris. However, if the idea that has been bruited of France replacing its military footprint in the Sahel by establishing a military footprint in Nigeria, inevitably that will destabilize the government in Abuja. You might also have noticed that just a few days ago, there was Cyclone Chido in Mayotte, a French colonial territory in the Indian Ocean. President Macron flew there and, of course, was hooted and jeered by the Africans who feel that they need to loosen, if not eradicate altogether, French colonial rule. But I mention that because Mr. Macron seized the opportunity to fly into Addis Ababa after visiting Mayotte. And what you are beginning to suspect and see is that France is going to try to outflank its former colonial assets in the Sahel, extending, of course, eastward into Chad, by extending or forming deeper influence in the two giants of Africa, speaking of Nigeria and Ethiopia. I don't think that this kind of maneuvering is going to work, but certainly we must keep a close and careful eye on this. And I'm happy to see that you mentioned Ghana, which is the site of a major community of Black Americans on the continent. And in Ghana, you had a recent election where John Mahama, a former president, returned to power. He can fairly be considered an ideological descendant of founding father Kwame Nkrumah, who delivered independence to Ghana in 1957. One, at least those in your audience, may salute and cheer the arrival in state power of John Mahama, but at the same time, it's going to complicate relations with Washington, which may feel that its toehold, its foothold in Ghana, including establishing a kind of military footprint in the West African nation, may be compromised by the return to power of John Mahama, which inevitably will lead to further and deepening CIA intrigue in that part of Africa.
You was just listening to the voice of legendary historian and author Dr. Gerald Horne as he discussed President Biden's recent trip to Angola, the new lawsuit that the Democratic Republic of the Congo is bringing against Apple, the genocide in the Sudan, the growing anti-imperialist Sahelian Alliance, and so much more. I am the People's Minister of Information, J.R. Valrey, signing off for Block Report Radio.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.